OJ, this for Central Cali right here. Yeah. Keep the poor from out my rights. Immigration ain't an issue for the right, cause it ain't right to have the right to keep the laws in favor of the job creator. When the job creator ship a factory for cheaper labor low enough to keep the people quiet and complacent. When the money's getting spent right on the soil that's adjacent to the place where they are starving. So hop a fence, coffee in my blood will keep the dogs up off my scent. Skin color versus the board of education. If you ain't catch that line, then you should study segregation. This is rap mediation. Time to snap you right back.
Hello comrades, welcome to Workers' Truth. This is Volgan, and today I'm joined by my fellow host and comrade Maine.
Hello.
And today we have a special guest, Mr. Caleb Maupin, on here today, who we have got brought to interview. Just like our previous interviews, we'll be asking for broad topics, which we'll have back and forth, and pretty much see where it goes from there. So, hello Mr. Maupin, how are you doing?
I'm well as anyone can be amid the pandemic and social distancing.
That's great to hear. So I will take the first one, and this is kind of more like a background. So everyone always has a story about how they came about to be where they are today, every leftist. So I'm interested in wondering, how did you become more radicalized in the position you are at today?
Well, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, but my mother was a member of a union. She was a member of the Service Workers International Union, the SEIU. And when she was a librarian in Canton, Ohio, which was a bigger city that was near the small town I grew up in, she went on strike with the other librarians. And I was a fourth grader, and I walked to picket lines with my mom. And that was my first introduction to class struggle or class politics. Being a kid, walking the picket lines alongside my mother and other striking librarians. And the city of Canton and Stark County, they actually had, these hired security guards to protect the library from these librarians. Standing there, and it was kind of a big moment for me of political education. In my household, my parents were rather conservative, but we did listen to a lot of folk music. We listened to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. That certainly had an impact on me as well. I will say this, that my mother was very religious, and she was not a Marxist and not very left-wing, but she was pretty religious, and the idea that one should live for a higher purpose than simply one's own short-term pleasure or profits or making money, that was pounded into my head pretty hard. The idea that life has more meaning than that, and that one should strive to acquire and work toward higher truths. So in that sense, it all kind of added up to that. But the pivotal moment for me was really 9/11 and the aftermath, because my town was very, very conservative. We were constantly having pro-military and pro-war rallies. One was made to feel like if they thought the war was wrong, they were a traitor to the country. I found myself in many classrooms being the only student to oppose the war and getting shouted at. And it was that moment that really made me delve into Marxism and try to understand the nature of the world around me. And I discovered Marxism on my own. No one in my family was in the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. My parents were not anti-war activists or hippies. They were both quite conservative during the New Left 1960s period. So I came to this on my own. But I'm not alone. Many young Marxists that I meet have a similar story. There is a demographic in the United States of folks whose, their grandparents were in the Communist Party, and then their parents were in Students for a Democratic Society and marched against the Vietnam War, and maybe now they're anarchists and black bloc. That's not where I come from. And most young people in the United States that are attracted to socialism and Marxism did not come from that background. These are people that discovered it on their own, looking for answers amid a crisis of U.S. society that seems to be intensifying every day.
Yeah, I would agree. I would definitely agree with that. Both I and Maine's backgrounds are very similar to that, but we're a lot younger. Our awakening kind of came from the 2016 election and the alienation that was kind of felt there. Because originally we supported Bernie Sanders. We were kind of like these liberal social democrat types. And then as the system kind of became to kind of unravel before us, it was very telling that obviously there's an answer to this, there's a reason why. So that's kind of what attracted me personally to Marxism. So how about organizations? What type of organizations have you worked with during your career?
when I first started looking into Marxism, I was shocked to discover that there was a Communist Party of the United States, because the way communism was presented to me in school was, quote unquote, everybody knew that it didn't work, the Soviet Union had fallen, and it was just this failed idea. And I got interested in it, and I was thinking, well, maybe there would be some situation which it could work or something like that. And I assumed that I was the only person in the world who felt this way. It never occurred to me. It was just common knowledge that communism was pure evil and it had failed and no one was interested in it. And so I got on the internet when the internet had just started, and I remember, finding out there was a Communist Party of the United States, and I was just blown away. And then I remember finding out that there was not one but many Communist parties in the United States, and I was really blown away. And there was a website, it's no longer on the web, called the Red Encyclopedia. And it listed all the different communist parties. And I was just fascinated. I was like, wow, not only are there people who believe in Marxism, but there are many of them. And they have different ideologies and beliefs. I found it to be fascinating. I found it to be really, really fascinating. I got in touch with different groups. Cleveland was the biggest major city near me. And at the time, the Socialist Workers' Party was in Cleveland. There was a Maoist group that was in Cleveland. And there were some other groups that were in Cleveland. But the two most visible groups were the Socialist Workers' Party and this particular Maoist group. And as the Iraq War got going, and as I was able to get to some protests as I got older and, could get there myself and could drive myself and such, I started to get involved with a particular Maoist group. And for my first year of college, I went to college near Cleveland, I was involved with this particular Maoist group. But I found their answers to things to be rather shallow. They would say things like Cuba was capitalist because it aligned with the Soviet Union and hadn't supported China. They would say things like, at the time, Bolivarianism in Venezuela and Bolivia and elsewhere was getting to be really big, and they didn't even really have an answer about what was going on there. It's just, well, they're not Maoists, so who cares? The only revolution we were really allowed to support was the revolution in Nepal, right, where the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist was taken, and they took power, and then they won. And then the next issue of this newspaper, we denounced them. So I felt like this particular Maoist group I was hanging out with, they weren't really in touch with existing struggles in the world. And on top of that, labor union, class struggle was something that was very, very important to me. And this particular Maoist group, their approach was that they appealed on more of a moralistic appeal. They talked about police brutality. They talked about U.S. wars. They weren't really interested in labor unions. They wouldn't make arguments like everyone should have health care and jobs. They argued that the wealth of the United States was built on exploitation of the third world. So if you arguing you want to make a better life for working people in the United States, that somehow that's chauvinistic. So they weren't particularly the group for me. The group that I spent a lot of time with, 8 years of my life with, was the Workers' World Party. And I learned a lot in the Workers' World Party, and I was able to travel internationally and all of that. They don't agree with me now. A lot of what I say is not their view. And at this point, I don't represent any particular organization. I am looking to build a think tank called the Center for Political Innovation that can carry out socialist education and build kind of a community of people that are dedicated to expanding socialism and kind of rescuing socialism from some of the ways it's been distorted and the synthetic left. And I can talk about that as a concept later. But yeah, at this point, I think we need to start building consciousness, and that I'm disappointed with a lot of the existing parties. I don't really think any of the existing parties really is a mass party in the sense that the Bolsheviks were, or in the sense that the Communist Party of China was, or in the sense that like the United Socialist Party of Venezuela is. I think it's time to reconsider a lot of what has been learned, learned from the new left era of the 1960s. It's time to re-examine the radical tradition and explore new territory. That's why I do these lives on YouTube every week and we have great conversations. And there's a lot of questions that need to be asked. There's a lot of rules that need to be broken. And we need to start building a mass movement to fight for working families in the United States and to challenge capitalism. But in order to do that, we need to look at what's working in other countries and what hasn't worked with the Western.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Workers' World. Have you heard of what's been going on the past year or two at the Detroit branch of it?
I can't comment on that. I'm not part of that anymore. I think the last time I did anything with the Workers' World Party was in 2015. So, they're great people. There's great people in that organization who've lived their lives. They've worked very, very hard to fight for peace, to fight for socialism, and they're great folks. And, good for them. I know they've had some splits recently. There was the Communist Workers League was one breakaway. There's struggle for socialism, La Lucha. I know, and even before I came around, there was something called the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and that Workers' World represents the Sam Marcy current, right? Sam Marcy was an ideological thinker who came out of Trotskyism. And he kind of developed his own kind of ideological mishmash. I mean, people jokingly call it non-denominational communism, where it came out of Trotskyism, but it drew from Mao, it drew from Kim Il-sung, it drew from Fidel Castro. They were very supportive of the Derg in Ethiopia, and it was a unique trend. And it was kind of an attempt to build a more radical version of the Communist Party USA. And they played an important role in the 70s and 80s, kind of stage managing anti-war rallies. And that's what the Answer Coalition and PSL does. That's kind of what the Workers' World Party aspires to do at this point. That's not where I'm at anymore. But great folks who are very dedicated. And, I wish them the best. I hope that they are successful in building good rallies and stuff.
Well, great. I want to move on to the next question. And that is about the CPI, or the Center for Political Innovation. You mentioned it earlier, and I've been following some of the developments with it for a while since it started up. It's a very interesting project, very interesting idea, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to more elaborate on it, and go into details about some of what the goals are, some of the plans are. I know there was a planned conference that has been delayed due to the coronavirus epidemic. But just like what some of the goals are, what some of the plans are, what are some of the things you'd like to see with it, and so forth.
Well, we were going to have a conference on April 18th. We reserved a very nice hotel in New York City, and unfortunately we weren't able to have it. But as soon as this pandemic is over and restrictions are being lifted, we're going to set a new date, and we are going to convene our conference. And that will be the conference in which the Center for Political Innovation is launched, where membership will be opened. At that point, people can apply to become members of the organization, and it will become a public organization. We also want to have a launch conference on the West Coast. We're looking to do that in Los Angeles, where we have a number of supporters. So we'll be having two conferences to launch, one on the East Coast in New Jersey and one on the West Coast in Los Angeles. And the idea is that, this is not a new party. Right. This is not the idea like, OK, well, there's the Communist Party, there's the Workers' World Party, there's the RCP and the SWP, and now we got the CPI. It's a new party, and Caleb's the leader, and then we got a new party. That's not what we're trying to do here. I want people that want these different parties to be comfortable coming to CPI events, being part of the Center for Political Innovation. But I also want people that are not part of these parties to feel like they can come. And I want there to be ideological disagreement. I want it to be a place where we can wrangle with the big issues that need to be asked. The main thing is that we need populism in the United States. We need this notion that the government has an obligation to serve the people. That needs to be reintroduced. Populism has become kind of a bad word in American politics, especially on the left since the era of Donald Trump. There's this notion that the left should strive for individualism, that there's this kind of phony, what you could call anti-totalitarianism that was developed by the CIA with their Congress for Cultural Freedom program. What we need now is the politics of William Z. Foster, of Gus Hall, of Eugene Debs, of Paul Robeson, of Huey Newton, the politics of building a mass working people's movement. I've tried to popularize the slogan, we need a government of action to fight for working families. Right? In the United States, there's this feeling that the government is best, that governs least. The government should just keep its hands off. The government should just make sure that profits are rolling in, let the market do its work. I disagree with that. And I think millions of Americans in their bones do disagree with that. And especially amid this pandemic, they see that there is a need for the government to take action, and not action to bail out big corporations, but action to protect the lives and incomes of the working class, and that working families are being left behind. And that there has been a huge effort to erode the kind of class consciousness that got us Social Security, that got us union rights on the job, that got us things like the Works Progress Administration, that enabled Roosevelt to build massive amounts of infrastructure, right? And that a mass movement for peace, jobs, democracy, and equality can be built, but that requires breaking with this pessimistic new left sentiments, this idea that any mass movement is totalitarian. I mean, we need to rediscover working class politics and populism, and that means pushing back against some of this identity politics. That means pushing back against against existentialism and postmodernism. And that means, kind of reviving the politics of actual Marxism-Leninism, but also studying Ba'athist Arab socialism, also studying Bolivarianism and socialism with Chinese characteristics. My feeling about all of that, I'm not a Maoist, I'm not a Trotskyist, I'm not a Stalinist, I'm not any of those. I call myself a 21st century socialist. I think we should study all of that stuff, but blindly adhere to none of it. And we should apply what works in our situation and figure out what political formula could win. We need to develop a winning political model and method for the United States in our time, and that requires us to not dogmatically or blindly adhere to any interpretation from the past.
All right. Well, for the third question that we'll be asking, you mentioned socialism with Chinese characteristics, and what I've been noticing from my experience, and I'm sure you noticed it too, at least from like the Maoist group you used to be part of from earlier, is that there is this trend on the left to discredit like actual existing socialist countries, like what they've done, their progress, and one of the biggest one has been China. There are many people that say that, oh, China's now state capitalist, or even like red fascists. That's the most extreme one I've heard, that they don't adhere to workers. They're now controlled by a bunch of bureaucrats that they've sold out to capitalism. And seeing your stuff, I've noticed that one of your big things is kind of talking about China and how far China has come, since 1949. And what would you say like about like, contemporary China and socialism with Chinese characteristics?
Well, okay, so there's a couple layers to come at this. I mean, first I'll answer why many socialists in the United States feel that way. I think that's the first thing. And then from there I'll answer why China is actually socialist. So I'll give you a two-part answer. Is that okay?
Yep.
All right, so first of all, why do socialists in the United States not like China? Well, the first layer to that is you have to remember that there's a very big layer of socialists and leftists in the United States that will not like any socialist country. And it's based on cowardice. That's really all it's about. Whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's Cuba, DPRK, no matter what socialist country exists, they're going to be against it because they see that the New York Times has accused them of human rights violations, and they know that the government of the United States is putting out, demonization and saying negative things about them, and they are too scared to take a hard stand, right? And we saw this with the Bolshevik Revolution. We've seen this with Venezuela, no matter what country it is, right? And these people are cowards when it gets down to it. They don't want to be associated. They want to be able to say to everybody, well, I'm a socialist, but I'm not like the bad ones. No, I'm a good socialist. Don't worry. And it's a weak, pathetic stand. And I really have very little respect for it, especially when we're constantly being hit over the head with communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. If your answer to that is, yeah, it's true, but you sound like a fool. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, there's a level of like narcissism. Sure, everyone who's ever tried socialism has failed, but I think I could get it right. I mean, that's a level of stupid narcissism, and it's embarrassing. But that said, that's the first layer. The second layer, though, is that China has a market sector. Right? I mean, China has not implemented socialism in the same way that the Soviet Union did, in the same way that Cuba or Venezuela have in the past. It's a very unique model. And I think it's important to also remember that in the 1970s, China positioned itself against not the United States, but against many of the countries building socialism, because the Gang of Four, which was an ultra-leftist clique that took power in the final years of Mao's life, they positioned China to be opposed to the Soviet Union, to say the Soviet Union was the main danger. So many of the people that were supportive of the Soviet Union, supportive of Cuba, didn't see China as their friend or their ally, right? And we know about the Kampuchea War, where China invaded Vietnam. And so because of that, many people that were sympathizers with the Soviet Union or sympathizers with the socialist camp during the Cold War were not really sympathetic to China because they saw China's actions during the late Cold War as problematic, and because of that, there's kind of a disconnect. But the main thing is that many folks don't understand that socialism is not simply the redistribution of poverty. Socialism is not everyone sharing everything. It's not like I was taught in school. Socialism is everyone gets paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. And even though these are bourgeois misconceptions about our movement, they've seeped into the movement quite a bit. A lot of communists will try to not wear fancy clothes. because they say that's bourgeois. I don't want to look like the ruling class, so I'm going to wear ripped jeans and these kind of misconceptions that we're a movement that advocates for people to be poorer, that we oppose wealth, that we we want chaos and destruction. These kind of misconceptions and distortions of our politics have seeped into our movement. So why is China actually socialist? Well, you have to understand what socialism is. Socialism is a period of transition between capitalism and communism. Capitalism is a system where the banks, factories, and industries operate simply according to whatever is profitable. Profits are in command, as Mao Zedong put it. So capitalism is profits in command. Communism is the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world. It's a world where there's no government, there's no borders, and there's so much vast material abundance, so much prosperity, that people can just kind of take what they need and do what they feel like doing. The human creativity and technology and abundance has expanded so much that human beings function on the basis of from each according to his own ability, from each according to his needs. Right? So that communism is very far off into the future. I mean, we're talking thousands of years. It's the ultimate ideal. It's the end of class struggle. But between capitalism and communism is socialism. What is socialism? Well, Frederick Engels, in his book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, said that socialism is production upon a predetermined plan. It's when the major centers of economic power, the banks, factories, and industries, work in the interests of society according to a central plan, not simply according to the chaos of production or the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production, right? That the state controls the means of production. And this eliminates the chaos of the market. It eliminates the situation where profits lead to situations like where there's all kinds of homeless people and empty houses, where people are hungry not because there's not enough food, but because there's too much food, where people are homeless not because there's not enough housing, but because there's too much housing, where advances in technology lead to greater poverty because it eliminates workers' jobs. All the things we're seeing play out now in a planned economy are eliminated. And because the state and rational reason controls the means of production, you're able to have unlimited growth. And China is a great example of that. They've had a huge, unprecedented rate of growth because in China, yes, you have a market sector, but the government controls most major industries, the government controls banking, and even private companies are not really free, right? At any point, the government can show up at a private company and say, you're doing this, and they have to do it. And that the economy of China is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party with its 90 million members. And that Chinese Communist Party has a hostile relationship in many cases with capital. Sure, it would like corporations to make more money and create more wealth, but at the same time, it controls them. And it works for the interests of the Chinese working class, the Chinese peasantry, the government bureaucracy, not the corporations. The corporations often have a very fearful and hostile relationship with the Chinese Communist Party because they just want to pursue their own profits, but the party forces them to do what's for the good of society. That's not capitalism. Now, is it a utopia? No. They have big problems with corruption, for example. There are many instances where we've seen problems, and the Chinese communists are the first to tell you that, right? And that they have had to develop what you can call a bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is a problem in most socialist countries, right? When you have scarcity, when you're building socialism on the basis of scarcity, you're going to have a layer of people, right? If there's a shortage of food, you're going to have a line to distribute the food. You're going to have to ration the food and have a line. But you're going to have a guard to guard that line to make sure that no one cuts in the line and takes somebody else's food. But that guard is going to demand that he get a bigger slice of food for taking on the responsibility of being the guard, who makes sure no one else steals anyone else's food. So you're going to have a what you can call a privileged bureaucracy. And Stalin wrote about this. Lenin wrote about this. It's one of the problems of socialism, especially socialism on the basis of scarcity. You're going to have government bureaucrats that have a lot of money that take care of themselves, and that's a problem. But the question is having political control over them, maintaining political control over the bureaucracy. Now, in the case of the Soviet Union, we saw Stalin attempt to control the bureaucracy with his Great Terror and the purges and whatnot, and it was kind of creating an atmosphere. That was how they tried to control the bureaucracy. We saw Mao Zedong with the Cultural Revolution have kind of a mass mobilization of the population to bombard the headquarters and try to control the bureaucracy. But now in China, they've done it a little bit differently, where instead of instead of using, coercion to control the bureaucracy, the idea is that if people want to get rich, they go into the private sector. If people are just in it for themselves, they go into the private sector and make money that way. And the Communist Party and the government is reserved for people who actually believe in the agenda of building a new China, building a more prosperous socialist society, and eliminating poverty and moving toward communism. So it's a little bit of a different method. And I think that we've learned from the 20th century. I mean, the Soviet model of socialism had amazing achievements, but it needed to be adjusted. The Soviet Union couldn't adjust. They tried to adjust with perestroika and glasnost, and the result was the Soviet Union falling. However, China was able to adjust in 1978 with the reform and opening up, and as a result, the Chinese Communist Party is far stronger. And China is a much more prosperous country than it was before. So, there's things we can learn from, and I don't think we should copy China's system. I think there's plenty to learn from it, but I don't think we should copy it. We're going to develop socialism with American characteristics for this country, and socialism everywhere has a unique application.
All right. Well, on the subject of China and Chinese, and the U.S. kind of like waging a propaganda war against socialist countries, and then in general, over the past year or so, I noticed there has been a massive upsurge in attacks against China. First, you saw Hong Kong, then Xinjiang, and now you see that the COVID crisis, like that there are members of the U.S. government that demand that China pay reparations. So, would you like to maybe talk for a minute about what China's actually been doing in these scenarios, especially with COVID, seeing as COVID's such a major issue, and how it's not how this China isn't the big bad boogeyman that they used to portray the Soviets as, and are now trying to portray China as?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this notion that we should blame China for COVID-19 is just absolutely outrageous. China got it before anybody else. They took action before anybody else. They warned the world about it, right? And at the time that they were taking action, our media denounced them for it and said, oh, look how tyrannical it is. They're forcing people to stay indoors. Oh, China has blown all of this out of proportion. And instead of getting ready and preparing our solution, we just demonized China for taking swift action against it. And now, even though we had a warning, now we're crashing and burning while they're starting to pick up the pieces and move ahead. There's this notion, well, they waited for 6 days. What was really going on, from what I understand, is they were trying to make sure that they knew what exactly was going on. And once they determined what was actually taking place, they announced what was going on. I mean, we talk about they waited for 6 days. How long did our government wait before doing anything, right? We know that back in January, a number of politicians like Dianne Feinstein and others sold their stocks because they knew that this was going to be big, but we weren't getting that kind of message from the government. The message we got over here was everything's going to be all right. We got it all under control. Well, our politicians knew things were going on. The cover-up of COVID-19 happened in Washington, D.C., not in Beijing. And so that narrative is just completely ridiculous. And it's about deflecting blame. People are furious about the economic situation right now, about how bad our government is handling it. So if they can, point the finger at China, point fingers to the other side of the world, it's a way of deflecting the upsurge of anger that is coming from the population. That's all that's about. When you don't talk about Hong Kong, I mean, Hong Kong has always been part of China. The British Empire seized it in the Opium Wars. And what were the Opium Wars? It was China wanted to stop the British Empire from importing drugs and importing other products and beating down their economy. So they tried to erect tariffs. The emperor tried to erect tariffs, and the British imperialists weren't going to tolerate those tariffs. So they sent soldiers, and thousands of people died in a war. And China was forced to accept the importation of narcotics and forced to accept, foreign corporations that would put all their businesses out of business. And the ultimate result of China's domestic economy being destroyed was millions and millions of deaths. Right? If you look at the results of the British Empire's domination and destruction of the Chinese domestic economy in the 1800s, it was mass death and national humiliation. People talk about how in some parts of China they would have signs in the parks that said "No dogs or Chinese allowed." Right? And it wasn't just Hong Kong that was seized by the British. There were other parts that were seized by the Germans, that were seized by the French. China was subject to a huge amount of national humiliation. And Hong Kong, under the treaty, it was returned to China. It is part of the People's Republic of China. Now, they maintain one country, two systems. But if you look at what these protests are really about, it's about enforcement of Chinese law, right? That basically the wealthy capitalists of Hong Kong want to be able to break the law, not in Hong Kong, but on the Chinese mainland. They want to break the law in the Chinese mainland, but only get tried in these local courts in Hong Kong that they are tight with the judges and they won't have a problem. They want to be able to go into the Chinese mainland, break the law, and not face, penalties under the Chinese mainland's legal system. That's an outrageous demand. If in Colorado, people in Colorado said, hey, we want to be able to go to New York City, break the law, but then not have to face any charges in New York, we take care of it back in Colorado, we would say that's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous demand, and it's about protecting wealthy corporations. It's Hong Kong-based businesses don't want to be, forced to follow the law on the Chinese mainland. That's all that's going on here. And these student protesters, a lot of them are young people that are just enamored with the West, right? And there's a huge amount of propaganda. All the reality TV garbage we have here in the United States, Real Housewives of New Jersey, all of that goes all over the world. And people have it in their heads that everyone in the United States is wealthy. Everyone in the United States lives just this wealthy, prosperous life. And if only you had a totally free market system, your country can be that way. I met young people in Iran who believed that. I met young people in Venezuela who believed that, right? That all over the world there are young people who spend a lot of time looking at their iPhones and have this completely delusional image of the United States. They see TV shows that are filmed in Southern California or in the Hamptons, Long Island, or New York City, and they think all of the United States and all of capitalism is that. And so in their minds, the only thing keeping their country from being that is socialism, right? And if they could just tear down socialism, they would get that. That's what the Hong Kong protesters think. They think the Chinese Communist Party, state control of the means of production, is getting in the way of their country turning into a Disneyland playground. And they're marching with the British Empire flag. And it's self-hatred. And there's an element of, Hong Kong folks, will say, well, we're not like other Chinese people. We're civilized because we were colonized by the British. It's really, really disgusting. And that's not to say there aren't some confused progressive demands too. There have been issues with corruption in Hong Kong. There are labor struggles. So a lot of times when these kinds of uprisings take place, people that have very different ideas get involved. There are probably progressive people who got caught up in the Hong Kong stuff as well. And I don't want to say that there aren't people that have legitimate frustrations or grievances. But overall, the Hong Kong separatist movement was essentially an effort to protect wealthy capitalists in Hong Kong and an effort by the United States and Wall Street and the Pentagon to weaken China and to cause problems for China. It was a proxy war against China, and it seems to have failed at this point. At this point in the COVID-19, it's pretty de-escalated, but it's caused a lot of economic problems for Hong Kong, I think, in the long term. Hong Kong benefits so much from trading with the Chinese mainland, and the engaging in those kind of protests in which we saw images of people being lit on fire and the way the protesters were acting in the airport. That hasn't helped Hong Kong's economy at all, ultimately. So I think that even though the protesters claimed they were fighting for Hong Kong, they ultimately ended up hurting their home city.
So for the final question, I wanted to ask, you are a self-described 21st century socialist, and one of the things you talk about a lot is 21st century socialism and examples of it, be it from Venezuela, Bolivia, or China or Vietnam, and its applications across the world and the different forms that 21st century socialism takes in the world. With that, I was wondering if you would care to elaborate and talk a bit about 21st century socialism, as well as what you think some things we could take from 21st century socialism and bring here into an American context, how 21st century socialism can be learned from here in the American context.
Well, it's interesting. If you talk about 21st century socialism, the term comes from Venezuela. Hugo Chavez said we need to build a socialism for the 21st century. That's where the term comes from. But it was essentially an understanding that as they were starting to build socialism in Venezuela, they couldn't copy the Soviet model. And what they ended up doing is they ended up building kind of what you might call petro-socialism, where the oil was controlled by the government, right? And the oil revenue was used by the state. And then a domestic economy was built around it, but that was a domestic economy that was controlled by the state because the state basically, all the domestic businesses were subsidized by the state. The state essentially controlled the private sector as well as the public sector as well as the communes by having control of this huge base of oil revenue. And it's similar to what Gaddafi did in Libya. It's actually similar to what Vladimir Putin did in Russia. It's you can call it petro-socialism, and that's what they did in Venezuela. And it was this understanding they couldn't nationalize everything. They couldn't become like Cuba. They couldn't become like the old Soviet Union. But they were going to maintain state control via the oil. That's what 21st century socialism meant for Venezuela, and they've had a lot of problems with it because of the oil price drop and stuff. And now they're moving to adjust that. They want to get into other fields and other areas. So they're shifting away from dependence on oil because they realize that's a weakness that Venezuela has had. But, if you look at 21st century socialism in China, right, it's state-controlled industries. And one of the things that they've done is they've built these kind of state-controlled mega corporations like Huawei Technologies, right, which is the biggest cell phone manufacturer in the world. And is it a private company in the sense that people make money out of it? Sure. I mean, a lot of people invest in it and make money. But at the end of the day, it's controlled by the Chinese state, and the workers, have shares and ownership as well. And it's considered one of the best places to work. And people work very, very hard to try and get a job at Huawei. I mean, if you can get in at Huawei, you're really a lucky person, because working at Huawei means that you are really, really well taken care of, and it's like the ideal place to work. It's kind of a state-controlled mega corporation. It's somewhat similar to Lenin Farms, which is the strawberry farm in Russia, right? It's led by Pavel Grudinin, who was the candidate of the Communist Party. It's a cooperative that makes strawberries in Russia, right? It's a strawberry farming thing. It has the best schools in the country. The people who work there, their wages are significantly higher than other people's. They have the best schools, the best health care, and they are themselves, in a way, the owners of this farm cooperative, right? And that these kind of mega corporations that are kind of operated as cooperatives but controlled by the state and subsidized by the state, this is a new form. It's not like state industries like in Stalin's USSR. It's not worker cooperatives like in the valleys of Spain or something like that. It's kind of a new form of these kind of state-controlled mega corporations. It's interesting, right? There are different forms that develop. But ultimately, I think that we also should remember that communism, that ultimate goal, is getting closer. One great example of communism and a change in the means of production, I mean, it's not an example of communism, I should say, but it's pointing towards something that's closer to that ideal, is we now have a situation where if you look at the tech giants, right? They're capitalist corporations, they exploit their workers, etc. But the way they make money is not by selling a product. You don't pay to get on Facebook, right? And not, in a lot of cases, you're not working, right, when you post something on Facebook, right? But you're generating profits for Facebook by simply doing what you would be doing. You're not paying for the service. They get advertising revenue from it. This is a situation where people are creating value, not by working, but by kind of doing what they feel like doing. And that points to the possibility. Imagine that Facebook were not run for profit, for example. Imagine there were social media corporations where people could simply, could simply post and do what they feel like doing and generate wealth in the process, right? And that's closer to that kind of ideal that Marx talked about, where people just do what they feel like doing and take what they need, right? So it's not that far off. And I think it's important to remember that every advance in social systems, if you look at throughout human history, you had hunter-gatherer civilization, for example. Well, it was replaced by slavery and feudalism because of a leap in the means of production. There was a new mode of production, agriculture, right? Domesticating animals, growing crops. A new mode of production enabled a higher social system to come into example. Capitalism came into existence because of the Silk Road and the trade routes and eventually industrial production. And as we look at artificial intelligence and all of that, we're now entering a period where a higher mode of production is emerging, right? We have 3D printers, and we have self-driving cars potentially very soon, and we're entering a period where we're getting toward what you might call post-industrial production, where there's not a place for workers at the assembly line. I went to Voldy Discussion Club in Sochi, Russia, and I had the opportunity of being in the presence of Jack Ma, the creator of Alibaba. He's a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And in his presentation that we heard there in Sochi, Russia, he said that artificial technology and artificial intelligence and the computer revolution is changing the way we have to live as human beings. And he pointed out that, human beings, we used to train people in the educational system to be like machines, right? That was the purpose of education, was to just train people to be like machines. But now anything that we would need people to be like machines to do can be done by a machine. And so we're in a period where we have to change the way we train people. We have to get people to be more creative, get people to be more emotional and more poetic, because that's all they have to offer. Anything mechanical can be done by a machine. So the human spirit and the human soul has to thrive, because the only way humans can flourish is if they unleash their human side, right? And that the elimination of workers from the from the means of production and the basically the eradication of industrial workers is laying the basis for the desperate need for workers to take control of the means of production, and for the means of production, the major centers of economic power, to be operated in a rational way. And when that happens, I think that ultimate goal of communism wouldn't be as far off as people believe, because we're already entering a world where the ability to generate wealth by machines is vast, and human creativity and human brilliance is becoming essential, and we no longer need people to be thinking and being trained to act like machines.
Yeah, when discussing AI, I've been noticing that there's this recent trend, like this push for UBI and everything. Considering that, with removing this mass population of workers from payroll and everything like that, would you say that this push for UBI and all these special things is capitalism trying to keep on living despite because if all these jobs were lost, then they would no longer have a consumer base. So would you say that that's kind of this push for UBI is trying to fill in that little gap that they're creating?
Sure. The push for UBI is about trying to stabilize society, because they know. And if you read, what was put out by Andrew Yang during the election, his book, The War on Normal People, it's very clear that capitalism cannot function with this higher level of technology. Just like the printing press and the various technological breakthroughs of the 1400s and 1500s ripped apart feudalism across Europe, artificial intelligence and computers are ripping apart capitalism in our time. That's what's happening. Capitalism is being ripped apart by advances in technology. It can't function. In capitalism, people only have value if they can sell their labor to a boss. And we're entering a period where the ability of people to sell their labor to a boss and the need for workers on the assembly line is going away. So you have divisions among the bourgeoisie. And I think that the lower levels of the bourgeoisie, they're more libertarian. And their attitude is screw these people, right? Screw them. Who cares? They should all start a company. They should be rich. They're stupid. Let them starve. We don't care. That's the Trump faction. That's the libertarian faction. But there's another faction, and you talk about the Rockefellers, the Eastern establishment, the old money New England families that are much more managerial. And they realize that Donald Trump, that Bernie Sanders are just a symptom of what's happening, that Americans are increasingly becoming impoverished and down and out, and that when people are hungry, it leads to, in the long term, big social explosions. Franklin Delano Roosevelt very, very famously said that hungry stomachs are what dictatorships are made of. Right? And it's this understanding that we're going to have all these people who are outcast and starving, have no place in the system, and they're going to fight back, and they're going to organize, and they're going to resist, and they might become fascists, they might become communists, but we don't want that. We want stability. We want our profits to keep rolling in. So what do we do about it? Well, their feeling is if we can just, tax the rich, the ultra rich can afford it, the lower levels of capital will hate it, but we can tax the rich and just have a little subsidy to people. That'll be okay. Give people a little stipend that they can live on. Meanwhile, we'll be encouraging them not to have children. We'll have, shows on Netflix like 13 Reasons Why that make them feel depressed and encourage them to commit suicide. And gradually we'll just kind of reduce the human population, and these people will just kind of gradually go away. We don't need to immediately starve them. We don't need to have riots in the streets. We don't need to have a big nuclear war or confrontation. We'll just kind of shut them up with some money and gradually let them just go away. And it's very pessimistic and dark, and it's Malthusian, but it's much more strategic and long-term. It's not dramatic, right? The libertarian element, they don't care. They kind of foster this kind of cruelty. the Andrew Yang element, the Joe Biden element, their attitude is much more, let's keep everything in check here, let's stabilize, let's give people, lots of pornography to watch, let's give people lots of Netflix, let's keep them looking at their phones, keep them distracted, keep them depressed, make sure they don't have any big life goals or aspirations, just let the next generation just kind of gradually go away. And I think there are millions of young people in the United States who very well can tell that that's what's being pushed on them, right? That there are sections of the ruling class that just kind of want to push them away, give them a little hush money, and have them just shut up and fade away. And there are millions of American young people who say, I don't want to go away. I do think we can get to a better future. I don't think the future is pessimistic and dark. I don't think because of global warming, we all just have to reduce the human population and we all have to be poorer. I do want to get out of this. I think we can solve problems like climate change. I think we can solve these problems, and I do think we can get to a better future, a socialist future. And I think that dark pessimism is very, very scary to a lot of young people. And, I wouldn't be I would want people, having UBI is better than not having it, right? I would want people to have some kind of income. I'm not against UBI, but the push for UBI right now comes from a very dark place. And it's social managerialism, I guess you could call it. It's technocracy. And it's a section of the ruling class that doesn't want a Trump, it doesn't want a Bernie Sanders, and it certainly doesn't want a socialist revolution. So it's trying to stabilize society while gradually reducing the population. And I think that's particularly dark and dangerous. And while I agree people should have an income, I don't agree with that worldview, and I think it's very dangerous. And in some cases, you can see that the liberals are what you might call, blackagendareport.com called them the more effective evil. And in some cases, you can see that. And, the Joe Biden element, the liberal element, they want to stabilize society, and they're much smarter about doing it, and they're much more internationalist in their outlook. So it's complicated. That said, maybe it's better than Trump. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I'm undecided. I don't endorse any candidate. But just like 2016, I don't know who the better candidate is. In 2016, I certainly was not going to vote for Donald Trump because of the horrendous things he said about Muslims and about immigrants. But I'm certainly wasn't going to vote for Hillary Clinton because of the horrendous things she said about countries around the world. And her whole campaign seemed to be calling for a crackdown on quote-unquote conspiracy theories and dissident ideas. Well, if you look at Joe Biden's campaign, same kind of thing. If you read his article that he published in Foreign Affairs magazine, he blatantly says the problem with Trump is that he's destroying faith in the Western capitalist system. He's causing disunity in NATO. He's causing, he's promoting quote unquote conspiracy theories that make people question the system. And that, Joe Biden is promising that if he comes to office, videos like this may not be on YouTube anymore. That's blatantly what he's saying, right? That questioning the status quo, disagreeing with the prevailing capitalist narrative, according to Joe Biden, that's quote unquote disinformation, and it should be outlawed, and pressure should be placed on the tech giants to make sure that guys like you and I don't have a voice. Well, I don't agree with that. I'm not going to vote for that. So I'm not sure, honestly. Trump is repugnant to me, but so is Joe Biden in a lot of ways. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope it's helpful.
Oh, it was very helpful.
Right.
So with that being said, that concludes the interview. Thanks for coming on. It's been great to have you here. A lot of interesting things said. Always great to hear your input on stuff. So thanks for being here.
Sure, and I guess I'll post it on my channel after it comes out as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, that'll work.
And you can send me the link?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
You can find Workers' Truth on the United Leninist Front YouTube channel.
If you have any topic recommendations, you can leave them in the comments and we will take them into consideration.
This has been Maine
and Volgan.
Thanks for listening, and solidarity.